O violent saint, return to me my 30s. Return to me the year I lost to cataclysm, the year I lost to grief, the year I lost to pandemic. Return to me every moment I was made to give up to catastrophe. Return to me the days I lost to each morning. Return to me the opposite of this aubergine gulf. Return to me the small space between myself and what I want. O annoying saint, return to me time. Turn to me standing in front of sea-thatched palms, left arm bent over steel gate, braids falling over left shoulder, my best impression of Josette. Turn to me Bibion's navy bandana print skirt, wrapped around my waist. Turn to me my hands that are their hands, my fingers bent easy, loose. Turn from me suffocation of the cupping hold that protects flame from wind, that love which has kept me alight. Spread fingers let air in. I know now I will not blow away. And even when I extinguish, there will have been hands clasped with sweat and covered in blood and twisted with hair and dripping in transited and cupped at the backs of necks. When I go out, there will be love. Turn to me flesh made soft by mezcal and posh, black beans and corn and Yucatan stomachs. O counting, watching, thinking ledger, turn to me my gaze clear as the full moon. Return to me my closed mouth grin, gentle, unlike the space spreading between my teeth. Turn to me my mother's gold through me. Turn to me mommy's gold band tight around my right index finger, the one I wear only when I am out in the world. Turn to me my earrings, golden ear, the ones I asked for and received, just so I could pose for pictures like this. Turn to me anticipation of life. O cruel saint, turn to me breath without dread. Turn to me growing green and thick as palm and cane. Turn to me my chance to cleave. O hibiscus saint, return to me what I know. The cane grows tall with a poison that doesn't kill so much as it renders its audience quiet, swelling the tongue for a moment of silence. And in that moment, while you finally consider how it must feel to have your breath taken, I will tell you. At the end, there are only two kinds of creatures. Ones who crawl into the recliner, chest to back, feet facing pre-morning's mauve, and ones who watch you turn violet.
You're listening to Conversations in Atlantic Theory, a podcast dedicated to books and ideas generated from and about the Atlantic world. In collaboration with the Journal of French and Francophone Philosophy, these conversations explore the cultural, political, and philosophical traditions of the Atlantic world, ranging from European critical theory to the Black Atlantic, to sites of indigenous resistance and self-articulation, as well as the complex geography of thinking between traditions, inside traditions, and from positions of insurgency, critique, counter-narrative. Today's discussion is with Diane Exavier, a writer, theater maker, and educator based in Brooklyn, New York, about her new poetry collection, The Math of Saint Felix, published in November 2021 by The Third Thing Press. Diane works across genres and geographies in this collection, making sense of what she calls the 4 L's: love, loss, legacy, and land. Her poetry, theater snippets, and thought pieces have appeared in the Atlas Review, The Racial Imaginary, Black Writers on Race in the Life of the Mind, and other publications. And in 2017, she published the chapbook, Teaches of Peaches. In our conversation that follows, we discuss the origins of the project, The Math of Saint Felix, its composition in sound and word, and the place of grief, mourning, remembrance, and beauty in poetry and poetics. Diane, hello, how are you today?
I'm doing well. It's really great to join you for this. I'm really excited for our conversation.
Me too. I'm really happy you made the time. So thank you in advance for this. We've known each other for a while. I knew that you had a collection of poetry coming out, and so I was excited as a friend to read it. And when it arrived and I read the collection, I was just really stunned. It's a beautiful and really complicated collection, and it made me, I was excited for you as someone I know, but also just really excited to have a chance to talk about this, because I think it's one of these collections that simultaneously, almost frighteningly intimate, but also extremely intellectual. And so it really, for me, it was a collection that really invited a conversation. And so when you said you wanted to chat about it, I was really happy. So thank you for that.
Thank you. Thank you for all of that. I was so excited when you reached out, because I love talking about this book, not just because I wrote it. I mean, obviously, right? But I think that thing you're saying about the intimacy and the intellectualism, there's a difference between feeling the thing you're writing and then being able to look back at it and be like, okay, how is this working? How is this operating? How is this maybe practicing or rehearsing itself in the world? And that's the part of the book that I really love, because it feels like the book gets to happen again. And that's actually secretly what I'm after. Writing the book is fine.
Oh, I like that.
I think my actual scam is getting to talk to people about it afterwards.
Well, let me start by asking you, before the after part, which doesn't seem to be a scam. It seems to be actually a generous thing on both sides. But go back to the origins of the book. A book of poetry is like any book. It's an investment of spirit that is hard to fathom. I mean, it requires so much of us to write and to revise and to edit and all of that. So clearly something moves us into books,
right?
Something beyond the vanity of your name on the cover, which is, not a bad thing. But I just want to invite you, just as a way of starting off, to narrate us into this book. What drew you to the kinds of things you wanted to write about and then did write about in the book, and to write this as a book of poetry? I mean, I know that you're a poet, but still to write this book of poetry about these things.
Yeah, well, I always say that I'm actually trained as a playwright. I mean, trained is a tricky word. I'm a very undisciplined playwright. I don't read enough plays. I don't see nearly as much theater as I should. But that's what I'm in the business of doing. I write plays. I teach young people how to write plays. Like, this is what I do with my life. And so poetry is not something that comes totally naturally to me. I had never taken a full-on poetry workshop, even as much as a poetry class. I've taken creative writing classes, but never something that felt like it was in the institution of poetry. So it was actually a pretty unlikely choice. I think I lean toward the poetic in my playwriting, but never to say, okay, I'm going to write a sonnet here, or I'm going to write an obede here. It's not what I have been trained in. It's not what I have studied. And not to say you have to be trained or studied in these things, but
I see what you mean.
Yeah, I'm a perpetual student. And so I feel like if I'm going to do something, I should have at least a kind of practice of it. But my mom passed away in late 2018, and she had an autoimmune condition that went undiagnosed for a while, and then just really went haywire. It went haywire, and so it felt like this thing that was happening very quickly, but very slowly at the same time. And when it was all over, I had the feeling that my entire world had actually fallen apart. Like I just couldn't understand anything. And
Uh-huh.
I couldn't understand the impossibility of that month. It was exactly 30 days from when she was admitted to the hospital to when she passed away. And I also couldn't understand how I was then supposed to go on with my life. And I
Mm-hmm.
just remember having the feeling, if I don't write through this, I will not be able to live. And so it was a real emergency.
Mm-hmm.
I really felt like in order to be able to piece my life back together in an actual way where I wasn't just going through the motions of, remaining alive, which I could do. Like I was going to work, I was
Sure.
eating well, I was taking care of my sisters, who they're grown women. I shouldn't say that as if they're children, but we were trying to be there for
Sure,
each
sure. I
other.
understand.
But it was really this feeling of, if I am going to have an actual life, there is something that I need to take account of, and I can't see unless I actually place these puzzle pieces down. And so
Mm-hmm.
I enrolled in a writing workshop. It was an actual playwriting workshop, and it was going to take a year. It was called the Poetry Generator. And so the conceit was that you would spend a year putting together a poetry collection. And it
Mm.
wasn't that I thought I was going to write a book, but I did need some structure outside of myself that could create a scaffolding for me. I needed a
I see.
container, and I needed some written way to contain my grief so that I could attend to my life otherwise. So that's really how I fell into the book. And then I would say maybe 4 months into uh, taking the workshop, I had a chapbook. I had a couple of poems put together,
Mm-hmm.
and I had a good friend who had released a book the year prior with the Third Thing Press, which is my publisher, and they're into what they call necessary alternatives. So that often means like hybrid collections or just books that are doing something different than you think
Mm-hmm.
that
Mm-hmm.
they would normally do. And he had the publisher get in touch with me, and she was like, I heard you're working on this thing. It sounds really fascinating. And I just said, yeah, I have this chapbook. I don't know how to make a book, but you can read it if you would like. And she immediately got back to me and said, okay, we need to make this an entire book. Like, you're doing something here that is important and necessary, and I want to
Mm-hmm.
be able to help you steward that. So that's really how it sort of came to be, as an idea or maybe as an intention. And then from then it was a real thing that I was working toward over the last 2.5 years.
It's really interesting to hear you tell that, because it's a mixture of the intense, the existential emotions of loss, but also practices and challenges that all of us as writers, whatever kind of writing we do, that we seek out, and
Right.
and professional workshops and encouragement from public. It's an interesting. It's like all the aspects of our lives sort of
I know.
coming together to form this moment. Yeah.
Yeah, I was so annoyed because I was like, I am a writer. Like, the way that I think that I'm going to get through this thing is by writing. I think
Mm-hmm.
writers talk very romantically about the need to write and the ways in which it can sort of help shape and form your life. And I kind of rolled my eyes when I signed up for the poetry workshop because I thought myself a cliche. Like, I couldn't
Yeah.
believe
Yeah.
poetry was really going to be the thing that would get me
That's
through
funny.
this. And it was, in a strange way.
Sure.
You're in communion with these people. You're arriving for the same task every week, which is to read and make poems together.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I needed that kind of clarity, maybe.
I see. Tell me about the title. I'm someone who I really love titles. Um, I love them as either sort of flair of language sometimes, or
Hmm.
the way they sort of tease in a mysterious way what's to come, or even ways that the titles evade and sort of hide in the body of the text. And
Yeah.
one of the things that I mean, it was the first thing I noticed, of course, other than your name on the collection, was the title, The Math of Saint Felix. And so I wanted to just ask you about that title, walk me through it, where did it come from? And also, like, what do you want it to do for us as readers? Where do you
Right.
want it to take us? I mean, it certainly intrigued me, and I thought, like, Saint, Felix, math,
Right.
calculation. That's interesting. You said puzzle pieces, right? Geometry,
Yeah.
but also transcendence and spirit and mystery. But,
Yeah.
where does it come from, and so where do you want it to take us?
I'm smiling because I have to make a disclaimer. I can barely do math. Like, I can barely calculate a tip on a restaurant bill. I'm terrible at math. I feel like I conked out on math like my junior year of high school in a bad trigonometry class. So while
Yeah.
I appreciate mathematics and mathematicians, it is not my ministry. I firmly believe in and am really attracted to systems of organization.
Mm-hmm.
And I like seeing maybe the operations of things, like orders of operation are very important to me. I think part of it is that I grew up Catholic. I went to Catholic school from pre-K to 12th grade.
Uh-huh.
And, your entire life as a student is predicated around these rituals of worship, right? So,
Mm-hmm.
Catholic schools in Brooklyn in the 90s and early aughts, it's not like we're saying prayers all day, but you are taking these religion classes. You are going to mass as a school. Like, you are doing these rituals of starting your days with prayer. And I think the routine and the rehearsal of that, it really kind of got into me, this feeling of, okay, what are the order of operations in my daily life practices? And also
Mm-hmm.
understanding maybe the trap of that, because like I think I grew up in a time where you didn't question things like that. And I also
Mm-hmm.
think about being a person living in the US, right? Like growing up in the United States. And there were things I did as a kid in relation to being a citizen to this country that were about rote memorization and routine,
Uh-huh.
right? Like, oh my gosh, what do you call the thing that you do with the flag? I don't even remember now. Where you like put your hand across your
Oh,
heart.
the Pledge of
Yes, the
Allegiance.
Pledge of
Yes.
Allegiance. Oh my God, it's been a while. They're gonna like revoke my citizenship. But that, like, we used to start the day with that. We used to do the Pledge of Allegiance, and then we would say a Hail Mary, and then we would say Good morning, so and so teacher, and the teacher would
Mm.
say Good morning to us. And that's the kind of order of operations that I just my life is founded on. It's founded on knowing the steps and knowing what's going to come next. And so I think that was my attraction to this feeling of math, that like, even if I don't know what to do, there is always a system that is operating, for better or for worse. I think there's
Uh-huh.
maybe a flip in the title there. And it's funny, I came to the title pretty like way before the book was done. That's often how I work. Even if I'm working on a play, I usually come up with the title maybe after I write the first scene, or even before I start writing it. And then I write in the direction of the
Yeah.
title. I sort of
I
name the
start with
thing.
titles for what it's worth.
Yeah.
I like titles that way.
It's
Yeah.
like, I don't know, it makes you feel like you have bestowed something upon something, right? Like that this is what it is. And
Mm-hmm.
now every day in my practice of writing, I get to arrive at this thing that has already been called into being somehow. Maybe it's like a good
Mm-hmm.
wish or something. It feels like a good omen that if I already know who it is, then every day I'm just meeting it again and I can keep writing toward it. And
Well,
yeah, does that make sense?
if I can interrupt you real quick, I
Yeah,
mean,
yeah.
you're not drawing on your Catholic education. I went to Jesuit college. That's consecration, right? You consecrate the task, right?
Right.
With a blessing.
Yeah, that's actually exactly what it is. It's a
Yeah.
blessing. I think. Oh man, yes, the Jesuits every time. But it's
I grew up
true.
non-religious, but I loved my Jesuit education. So.
Yeah, it is a blessing. It's sort of, I think of like Lucille Clifton or something, like blessing the boats. It is blessing this thing and then kind of
Mm-hmm.
arriving to it again and again. And by the time I was kind of just starting to like work out these poems, I remember talking to a friend and saying, I'm working on this thing, and I wasn't thinking about getting published at the time, but I said to her, I'm going to call it the Math of Saint Felix. Felix is my mom's last name.
Ah.
And I think the thing with the word saint, maybe I was thinking about that blessing. I think I was trying to wrap my head around what it meant to sort of behold the life of this woman. And then as I'm, thinking about her life, I'm thinking about the lives of her sisters. And my birth mother died when I was a baby. And so my aunt is my second mom who raised me. And so thinking about these women and really wanting to consider them as women beyond what they had become to me in my family, which were these mothers, right? That you sort of like are a bit distant from you in a way. And it made me think of saints, right? The way that they are venerated and the way that even though when I was a kid, I learned about the lives of saints, and you always learn about their lives as, simple, humble people before they become a saint. But then when you pray to the saint, you're never thinking about that just regular person, right? You're never thinking about just Therese in the middle of France minding her business as a young girl. Like, you're never thinking about, Paul just hanging out. Like, you think about them on this pedestal. Yeah. And I was really trying to interrupt that in my own grief process of like, how do I mourn my mom? How do I mourn my mothers while allowing them to still be the women and maybe the girls that they were? Because it's part of the way in which their lives were also taken away, is that they never got to just be girls. They never got to just be women. Like, it was always this like really heavy burden that they were rolling with to be these figures in a family, in a society, and how that wore on them until their bodies wore out.
Rehearsal and I am the ledger who carries the stone, and the stone is the book written in violet ink, and the book is a gathering of things complete in themselves, and the book gathers imaginations, and imaginations radiate, and the imaginary is a root of another side of yourself, and imaginaries take shape. Etched in the ledger are sundials and lunar calendars of people becoming and fading, waxing and waning, turning to and turning away from. Watch how they grow large in the violet sky. Watch when they decrease in illumination. I am the learning ledger. My mother's hands are their own and each other's, and my sister's and mine, decreasing in live illumination, only to grow larger in reflected imaginaries. A play is only an accident of rehearsal, and rehearsal is always a practice.
So let me. So now we've gone from sort of the origins of the book to the title. So we're not quite into the poems, because I actually wanted to ask you about the inside of the jacket.
Yeah.
And this might be two things about the inside of the jacket. First, I wanted to ask about the words, where there's a characterization of you, which I hadn't read until I'd read through the collection. And then I read it and I really loved it, but I wanted to ask you, how it resonates for you, where it describes your voice as a poet as weary prophet. I thought weary prophet was a really interesting phrase, especially given what you were just saying in terms of, what it meant to arrive at this moment of emotional exhaustion and loss, right? But also to speak in a way that's not simply mourning, but also something else, a prophet. And then the book itself is characterized with these three words: elegy, ledger, and legacy.
Yeah.
So I wonder if you could just sort of take me through these characterizations and what they mean to you as a writer.
Yeah, it's funny. Book jackets and bios and, blurbs are strange things. They sort of feel like they come after the book is done. They're part of a kind of marketing process. But this is something that I feel like is true. That description was written by my editor, Anne DeMarkin, who is one of the team members of the Third Thing Press. And we had a really it didn't feel intense. I mean, it was actually a really lovely process, but it was really intensely intimate of putting the book together. And I think what was happening, we would meet every week, and
I was also updating her on what was happening in my life. And this is a book that got written over quarantine. And so we would have these meetings, but we were also reporting to each other about what was happening in our respective environments. She
Sure.
lives in Washington. I live in Brooklyn. And I was reporting to her about the state of things in New York at the time. I was reporting to her about the state of my family. And she often remarked like how much reporting I was doing, like she was sort of confused as to how it could be possible that I could just kind of list, all of these losses or like
Mm-hmm.
all of these incredible sort of tragedies or catastrophes that were going on, and yet still turn my attention to the word or turn my attention to the page. And
Uh-huh.
it's because I'm always also looking to the future. And I really believe in that. Like, I truly believe in like living a life. Like, I really want to live a
Mm-hmm.
life. I really want to live my life. And like, I think there's something about reporting on what's going on while also really holding in your hand like a pearl of like what could possibly be, even though in
Mm-hmm.
the moment it doesn't look like that could happen at all. And so there is a
Mm-hmm.
tiredness of it, right? Like, how many times am I gonna go over this again? How many times am I going to have to pick up the phone and tell somebody that somebody else has died? But there's also like an insistence, and I think that's what she was getting at. And so I
Mm-hmm.
take, I have a big family, and I'm really only one of the few who kind of took a creative lean. It's funny, my father used to write poems, which I didn't learn until a few years ago. But part of that creativity is not just because like I'm out on my own island trying to be like ooh
Mm-hmm.
la
Mm-hmm.
la Diane. Like, it really is. This is how I know to record these lives, and somebody has
Uh,
to do it. I think I really take that seriously. Like, somebody must do it. Um,
yeah.
yeah, let's we sort of didn't exist at all. Um, so yeah.
I mean, it's interesting. You just wait that last bit that you said, and the way it picks up this like elegy, ledger, legacy, trio that it's a characterization of the book. And I mean, it just reminds me of this part of Patrick Chamoisseau's School Days, and I've quoted it a number of times in my writing about the character is written in the first person. That he writes against genocide, like he writes his name
Mm,
out over and over, and there's a sense of like the ledger not being a bureaucratic document, the ledger being
yeah.
like a form of praise that he was writing his Creole name, right? But also making sure that that legacy doesn't die, that it is legacy, right? That it is something that can be, as weary as it is, still oriented towards the future, right? That sense of prophecy. And I hadn't thought those two things together, but just as you were talking, I mean, I try so often to bring things back to that Chamoisseau quotation because I just a passage from School Days because I love it, but it resonates, I think, really well with the way that description, and it does capture something really central about the poetry collection is about making sure that in the midst of death things don't die.
Yes, absolutely. And I'm so glad you brought up the Chamoiseau, because now I'm thinking about the Creolite in Praise of Creoleness. What is the
Yeah,
title of that book?
yeah,
Um,
it's in praise of Creoleness or elegy for Creoleness, if
yeah,
you Elegy.
exactly. And thinking about, my family's from Haiti, and so Creole is a very oral language. I mean, now it's
Mm-hmm.
written down; it's like the official language. It's what they're learning in school these days. But my mom's whole generation, like, they were writing in French, and when they moved to the States, were writing in English, but they spoke Creole. Like, and we would
Mm-hmm.
speak English sometimes at home, but it was really a mishmash of both. But every story, just remember growing up and feeling like, okay, first of all, these stories are crazy. Like, all of you people in this family are totally bonkers, wild people. I can't believe y'all all got here like this. Um, and also so many of you, just like how many people can be in a sort of first, cousin situation. Um, but feeling like the orality, I just remember feeling like,
I need to get this down, that like there's something in like the laughing, right? Like the sighing in between stories, like those sounds that make up the gossip, that make up the rumor, that I never wanted to lose any of that. And so it's part of why I write, because like if I can just kind of catch some of that stuff out of the air, then I can actually turn what legacy is, right? So that it stops being about documentation. It stops being about like a legal birth certificate, a death certificate, a social security card, like these things that you look at them, they don't quite add up. And then it can be about that story that my mom told me about getting off of the plane and going to the wrong 53rd Street, or that story about, having to go pick up some water in a bucket and coming back, but she gets into a fight with a girl and then she has to go home and explain why there's no water, right? Like that will not be in a document. And I think that's where legacies is like that stuff that is not in sort of like legal or bureaucratic documentation. It's not in the documents of the state. And that's really important to me, to be able to like hold those things and reflect them back somehow.
Yeah. And you reflect them back in your own voice. But also I think, and we'll have a chance to get into this a little bit more, but one of the things I love about the voice of the poems is that it has that sense of reportage, while also a lot of very deep, poetic indulgence and embellishment, which I think that's how you show love, right? Is by being yourself, but also deferring to the other.
Yeah.
And just thinking still now of the cover, the cover title, the sort of fold with the dust jacket, with the characterization, and then the inside of the cover that bookends, two photographs, which I was so drawn in by the photographs, and I hope anyone who listens buys the book just to see the photographs. It took me a while to even read because I was just really taken in by the photographs. They're vernacular in the sense of they're not, studio productions.
Right.
They're everyday photographs, but they're very profound. They're really beautiful. They are clearly saturated with memory, which I find really interesting, the way they communicate their saturation with memory, while also being, and in that way also simultaneously being intimate, but also opaque, right? It's like, what is this? But I also feel very close to something.
Yeah.
And so I'm just invite you, however you want to talk about those photographs, and really just why would you put them as ways of bookending the collection?
Oh, I love those photos. Well, first of all, my mothers have never taken a bad picture in both of their lifetimes. It's incredible. If you look at the family album, it's like all hits, no bad pictures. It's insane.
Wow. That's amazing.
I was not graced with those talents, those genes. I don't know what, if it was the camera. I don't know what's going on, but those two photos in particular, and they're not from the same exact time, right? Like these are not two photos that were taken the same day, but I don't know. They stick out to me so much. And to hold them in my hand is that feeling that you're talking about. It's like this incredible intimacy, and you don't quite know why you're drawn in, because it's just these two young women sitting in chairs in different ways, possibly. Maybe there's something in the eyes, but I remember during the writing process, I had a very large bout of writer's block. This is not a thing that panics me. I don't know. Life has a lot of things going on. If I can't write for a while, it's really not the worst thing in the world. But I had gotten through a first draft of the book and then spent 3 months not writing anything. I was doing everything else. I was mopping my floors. I was like fixing the grout in the kitchen, like anything other than writing. And I didn't know what the book needed other than these copy edits that I, had made a few months prior. And I sat down one day and I just looked at these photos and I started crying uncontrollably. And I didn't know why. I just realized that I really missed these women, and I missed their missed opportunity to just be women. And I started doing a kind of ekphrasis exercise, which is, ekphrasis is a kind of form of poetry where you write a poem sort of inspired by another work of art. And so it's a lot about deep observation. It's about sitting with something, right? Beholding something, and then translating that into language. And I do a lot of ekphrasis with images because visual work is just really important to my craft. And so I just did some really plain descriptions of those pictures, just naming objects in the background, describing the color of their dresses. And then these poems started coming out of it. And so the middle section of the book, which is called Saint, is basically an elongated ekphrasis of those two photos and then maybe 2 or 3 more. And that was the last section of the book that I wrote. And it kind of almost goes unedited. Like I wrote that in one long shot. I cried the whole time writing it. And I handed it off to my editor and she was like, yeah, okay, this is it. Like, this is actually the thing that the book was missing. And now we're done. And now let's just like go through and kind of wrangle it together. But I didn't write anything new after that. That was the last new thing I wrote. And I think for me, what I love about those photos and having it in the, kind of bookend the book like that is because I want readers to do the thing that I have been doing for years, which is trying to behold these women and knowing that there is something that I cannot describe that is going on with them. And that might mean something for how I'm living my life. There's just something that you cannot know about those photos. And I don't know why that is. I don't know. They're just photographs. But there's a combination of whether it's the color, whether it's their gazes, it feels like a secret is being held. And I just am spending my whole life trying to figure out what that secret is.
Yeah, I mean, I think aesthetically, my own sort of encounter with the photographs and it sounds very much like what you're saying is, so many photographs, especially wonderful and beautiful photographs, the camera really dominates the subject, right? And that's where you get really interested in the art of the photograph. But it's inverted here, where the women are absolutely dominating the camera. They're completely unbeholden to the camera, while also being totally inside the frame. It's not a gesture that goes outside the frame. They're inside the frame and they dominate the camera. And there's something, really amazing about that, because it does have that intimacy, but it's also like we can't imagine ourselves into the camera because the camera is not the thing that is telling us this story. And in that way, I do think the photographs walk us in and out of and back into the collection. I mean, I felt like that when I saw it, when I looked at both of them and then I read, I felt like my reading was sort of watched by those photographs. And then when I got done, I think turning the page and seeing the back end or whatever, I don't know if it's verso or recto, I never know which is which, but the last page bookend photograph sort of pushes you back to read again. I really think there is something like, the poetry, and I want to ask you about the style in a moment here, but I think that part of what's so interesting about the poetry is its intimacy and opacity at the same time, which is like the photographs. But then it was like the opacity of these photographs really make you go back and say, whatever you think you learned, there's a lot you didn't learn. So you've got to go reread.
Right.
I don't know if this was your design, vision, but I think it in that way, the photographs and the poetry aren't that different.
That is, wow, that's really wonderful to hear. I mean, now that you say that, I want to say, yes, that's what I meant the entire time. But I actually, I had some reservations about including the photos at all. And when I wrote that section, and I was telling Anne, I worked with these photos, I was trying to practice some ekphrasis here. She was so into it, and she was really gentle with the ask that she made. And she was like, I know these are our family photos. I know how much care you're trying to take of these people. And I don't want to just sort of splay,
right? Their images just without regard. Because there's also a thing about sort of capture and
Sure.
how an image can you can lose grip of it once it's just out in the world. And I take that very seriously as I write about my family. It's very intimate work, and I don't ever want to just leave them hanging out there, right? Like I don't want to make assumptions about these people. I don't want to sort of put them up for fodder in order to just write a book.
Sure.
And so I did at first, I was a little nervous about having their full faces in the book. It's part of why the section breaks are with these images that are clipped, because there was something that I was wanting to keep away, or maybe to keep to myself and my family, and not sort of just like totally offer out. So there is this thing about like a kind of transparency and opacity working with like in the book itself. But when she showed me the mock-up, I couldn't say no, because it's exactly like you said. I felt like these two young women, and it's very pointed that they're not totally adults, right? Like they're teenagers in those photos. And so you have these two young women holding this book up, like quite literally, and I couldn't not do it. I don't know. I found myself thinking a lot about Wayward Lives. I was thinking a lot about Saidiya Hartman's work and how that book works with images as well, and what happens when you go into the archive. I'm constantly digging into my family archives, and the care that you need to take, and it's not always as easy as you think it is. Like it's not just about telling a nice story about your moms. Like it's about telling the truth, and then it's about figuring out, okay, what truth am I trying to write through and offer in poems and indulge and all of that stuff, and what do I learn that nobody else needs to know? Like there were several things that I learned throughout this process that I really had to keep for myself.
Sure.
And I think the work with the images is really like telltale of that, of like what I wanted to offer out and be generous with, and what I had to say, no, actually, this is not for you.
Interesting. Yeah. I just find the composition process, whether it's an academic book or a creative book, to be so revealing, because, it's a human endeavor. And I think that the emphasis on sort of final product and sort of what does it look like, and even thinking of it as a product is it's not the event of the text. And I think these photographs really remind us that, and that's part of why I started with these kinds of questions with you, is because I feel like the collection and just the physical book itself is trying to make sure that we don't separate the end product from process, or even think of it as a product. So let me ask you about the poems themselves. I mean, one of the things that really struck me, and I mean this in a really positive and beautiful way, but it's can be a really disorienting read at the level of style. And that's because there's no way as a reader to get into a rhythm of reading. And that to me was an interesting readerly experience, right? Because some of it are short snippets of a world, right? Some are long meditations. There are lists, right? Sometimes they're lists of things. Sometimes they're lists of characterizations. Sometimes they're lists of kinds of mourning. You have prose that can be really mundane and really interesting. Some of it's playful. Some of it's devastatingly sad. And a number of the poems, like, well, obviously it's poetry and that sort of tradition of sung speech, it has to be heard even as you're reading. But some of it has to be read on the page, because the words are scattered and fragmented and sort of adrift across the pages, sometimes multiple pages, or sometimes just on one page. And I felt like, in some ways, the style sort of embodied this weary prophecy, right? The weariness is like, there's no one sort of place that we can sort of draw everything from. But I was just wanted to ask you, like, how do you characterize your style as a poet and the poetic composition in this book, given that it's such a constellation of styles, and I say constellation, I just want to say real quick, I say constellation here intentionally because the way a constellation works, like in stars, is somebody has to point out the way it makes a shape, right?
Yeah.
Point out that's a bull, that's a scorpion, or whatever the constellation is. But it sort of lays there hidden with the scattering of stars. And for me, there's a constellation kind of experience reading of all of these different stars, all of these different ways of reckoning with memory and loss and future. But it also has an overall shape. And rather than characterize that overall shape myself, I want to ask you, how do you think of your style, and what is the constellation that's working here?
Yeah. Well, I tend to say, and this is not being super humble or self-effacing. But I really mean this. I don't know how to write a poem in certain ways. What I do know how to write is an event. And that is for me what the act of poetry is, right? It's about these encounters, and it's about what is the emergency of the word. And I could have written a collection that felt like a more formal, perhaps more traditional or conventional collection. There are wonderful like if I think of Sharon Olds, Forrest Gander, or Louise Gluck. Forrest Gander has this beautiful collection called Be With that he published after his wife C.D. Wright died. And those are grief poems, but they are very much a poet's collection of poetry.
I see.
And I think because I write for performance, what my mind is always attuned to is what is the event of this thing? What am I trying to gather people around? And what am I trying to meet people with? Like, what is the meeting point? Where am I trying to get people to meet? And so the writing, or how I would describe it, if you're talking about sort of styles, it's really a rehearsal. I'm trying to rehearse all of these different strategies, different tactics of getting through grief, right? And part of the test that I've given myself is like, maybe I can work on this grief if I really just sort of sit down and consider these women's lives. And then to consider their lives, I have to think about my family's life. And to think about my family's life, I have to think about my family's lives. And to think about their lives, I have to then think about my life. And to think about my life, I have to think about these new connections that are happening in my life. And I could have done something else where I use that as content or material and just write about it. But the way my brain works is that all of that becomes rehearsal. And so I know all of that. I know like, okay, these are the things that I'm trying to do. And all I have to do now is rehearse them. I just have to keep trying them. I just have to keep practicing them. And so that's why the writing comes out as it does. And like, I think when you talk about constellation, yeah, like through all of that rehearsal, which for me is very rigorous, like I think what is really happening is writing. Like I'm not going to lie about that. Like I really wrote a lot out of those poems. But then we can meet after the exhaustion, and I can point out to you, okay, well, for me, that was the big bear, but what are you seeing? Or for me, that's, the spoon. I didn't learn anything in school.
The Big Dipper.
The Big Dipper. So
I looked up constellations recently to figure out which ones I actually knew and which ones I just invented. I'm not sure there's a scorpion actually, but
yeah, I know all the parts of this book. I know how they're working for me. I see what I was rehearsing, and to me, it's very plain and sometimes a little mundane or boring. I'm like, oh yeah, that's what was going on there for me. But I can let go of that at the point that I am now. I think going through the process of writing is what's important to me. And so whatever ends up happening as a result, I want to offer out to the reader to kind of make sense of for themselves. But it's a process. It's really a process forward thing. And so if I do nothing else, having gone through the process of poeming, so poeming as a verb is the thing that I'm really, really after. And then what comes out
for me, I can call poetry because like that was the act of what I was doing, right? Like really the action verb of what I was doing, as opposed to saying that I'm going to sit down and write a poetry collection. People do that wonderfully. I am not one of those people.
and, 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 and I know my first mother from my second mother. I can tell by where I see their hands, in photos and memory. My first mother's hands rest gently on the arms of a wooden chair, her legs crossed under the skirt of a tightly pleated fuchsia dress, a white flower in her hair. My second mother's hands cover mine as she tells me that she likes my nail polish, for a moment wrapping her fingers around my fingers. My first mother's hands caress the fronds outside a building whose location is now lost to sepia. My second mother's hands braid my hair down my back, a salmon-colored tongue jutting out from her lips, open in concentration. When I look at my mother's hands in photos, I picture mommy's hands from what I remember. Imagine and recall. Recall to imagine. My mother's hands are their own and each other's.
So so when I'm thinking about that characterization you just had, I this is more of an aside, but the way you were describing that, I wondered about about your sort of imagination of what, or not imagination, but your strategy in terms of making this poetry sort of in between all these spaces about family, self, and reader, and all the multiple things in between. It actually kind of sounded like marking out parts of a stage. I wonder if you're like a playwright poet that way, right?
Yeah.
It's like trying to figure out, like, you're going to come stand here, but of course, what it means for you to stand here is going to be something more than something I could control. But
yeah.
But I that's a really interesting to hear you talk about that. That mixture of styles coming from not knowing how to write poems as that, as anything other than this constellation of styles. And in that way, both in terms of the content of the poems and sort of affective dimensions of it, but also just the styles, as I was saying, the way it's, there's prose that's short, there are lists, there are long prose, there are long poetic pieces, there are words that have to be seen on a page where you're sort of puzzling. One of the things that it did remind me of, and in some ways this is indulging, ways we've worked together in the past in Caribbean literature and theory, it did remind me very much of Edouard Glissant's notion of relation. And also the function of opacity in his work, which he always talks about as, opacity is not the opposite of contact or communication.
Right.
What it is it's a protective withdrawal where certain kinds of vulnerability are held while others are given, right?
Yeah.
In order for there to be poetic connection, but also the dignity and integrity of vulnerable peoples or memories. But the styles also work that way, right? The way they interrupt each other, the way that chaos and relation in Glissant's work are not just sort of harmonious moments, but they're also moments of that jolt you and shift you and change you and throw you off balance in really productive ways. And I thought just visually, there's so much of that. There is so much in the sound of the poetry that is that relation and chaos. And also, as you've already really been talking about, that play of opacity, of revealing but holding back at the same time. So I was just wondering, how much you think about somebody like Glissant in whether it's your writerly practice or just in the aims of what you want to do in bringing family and person to the page.
Yeah, I think about Glissant all the time. I think that's always the it's really the fulcrum of my work is like trying to dial that opacity. And it's not being opaque for the sake of being opaque, right? Like it's not about hiding things to be mysterious. It's not about, sort of hiding things away or creating a screen in terms of aesthetic. It is, I'm going to return to that image of the stage that you provided. Opacity for me as a writer of performance is about, there's an audience and there's a stage. And sometimes what I'm doing is turning to the audience and addressing the audience. But sometimes what I have to do is actually turn my back to the audience and take care of the people on stage. And when I think of this book, it's really my family on stage. And I am trying to figure out, okay, who's upstage left? What year do you sort of come downstage center? Like, where are you over here? What's going on with this little choreography or composition over here? And there are moments where I cannot be talking to the audience at the same time. And that for me is the opacity, right? It's also about care. And it's about when these sort of like, gestures of vulnerability, when they are for which parties, at least for me. And so that feels like a feeling, right? That's like almost like an intention or a kind of value that I write with. Yeah. When it comes to the relation, I mean, beyond it being about relations, just like quite thematically, like, right? Like it's about these people you're related to. I think the words on the page, it's a very visual book for me. Like there are lots of this that I am not actually interested in reading out loud. It is about this physical encounter with these words in relation to each other on the page in ways that I'm not interested in making sense of, so that they can just do what they need to do on their own. And I think that's the other thing about relation, that it's not about your control, right? That if I am able to put two next to each other, and I'll say two, because right, it could be two things, it could be two people, two elements, or whatever, two creatures, that I don't then control their interaction. And so, especially towards the end of the book, when the language just starts to fall apart, I think it returns to that weariness, right? That weary prophet. But a good prophet is always at least going to put the things in relation to each other. So even if at that point I can't quite make sense, I know enough to put them next to each other. And maybe it's not now, maybe it's like a few years from now where some sense kind of arises for me that's not quite there in the moment. But at least I just, covered my bases by putting them in relation. And I feel like that's such a generous thing to me, right? To then not try to control the means, to not control the dance, to just like let it do what it needs to do. Because it's not for me to say, like and I also can't because I'm tired, because I'm sad.
No, that's what it means to write from a place of intimacy, I think, is that those hesitations aren't just ethical, they're also emotional. Spiritual. And it's interesting, the last little bit of what you said, as all of that was just really brilliant. I'm glad I asked. But one of the things that also came to mind in this sort of, collage constellation of styles, and I it's worth mentioning for people who haven't seen the physical book. Even the title, the is backwards and upside down. Math is rightwards up but backwards, and of Saint Felix, and sort of left to right, right side up prose. So even just as before you even open it, it is experimenting with spatial organization. But the mixture of styles and spatial organization, and the way, as you say, this couldn't be an audiobook, right? Because people have to look at the page and find their way. And by the way, I love the non-imperial nature of the way you articulated that. It's like, you're not trying to control the reader in relation to it, while that's an invitation in, but also, of course, that moment of opacity. But also reminded me of another person who I know has been important for your own thinking, and somebody we worked together on, Wilson Harris, and his real rejection of the capacity of something like epic, of allegory, these sort of one-dimensional frames that dominate sort of the white European tradition. And for him, there has to be like a creolization of these frames, which is to put these things in relation to each other so they dissemble each other, but also create new forms, or even just massive juxtapositions that don't get reconciled. And for him, right, it's about the inability of those white European frames of writing to tell the story of the Black Americas. But also it reminds me of something you said about that idea of like sort of seizure or capture that you try to avoid. And that also for him is the rejection of things like myth and affiliation, is to try to like not as a writer of identity, of a writer of memory. Wilson Harris doesn't want to repeat those colonial impulses towards domination and control. And so that was another thing that came to mind, both in what you were saying, but also in reading the constellation of styles in the book. Am I onto something here, or is this again just going back to Creole imagination and superimposing?
Yeah, totally. That I feel like the Creole imagination is my playbook. It's funny. I think when I encountered these ideas from Wilson Harris, from Glissant, from Chamazo, right? Like Lorna Goodison, like all of these like poets and writers, deeply thinking about considering the Caribbean, and also thinking about their lives as writers, as people who are committed to the word. It's one thing to study it and be like, yeah, I rock with this. This makes a lot of sense. It's another thing to then be in a situation that calls for you to take a position on that. And what I mean by that is that what Wilson Harris Harris is saying about being careful about falling into these traps, these traps of genre, and those traps of genre leading into an abyss that you sort of can't quite climb out of. I had to be really careful about that. Like, I am a Black woman writing and making theater, and there is like an appetite for Black pain, for Black grief. Like there is a real, people want these stories, and there is something so insidious and something so gross, I'll just like use that word, about the ways in which some of these narratives are consumed. And I had to be careful about what I was doing when I wrote this book, that I didn't just fall into a trap of another Black girl without parents, or another Black family that's just lost a bunch of people, and how sad and how personal, right? Because that's also the thing with these narratives, is that because they are so personal, you get to sort of like not look at these sort of bigger things at hand, right? Like these sort of like structural reasons as to, well, why is there so much loss in this family? Like what could possibly be going on? Why are they losing so many people in an anti-Black world? You don't get to have that discussion because you get stuck on sad. Like, oh, how sad. Like, oh, how beautiful. And for me, the sort of quickest, or maybe most surefire way to not fall into that trap is to not get sort of hunkered down in one genre. That if the thing is always running away from me by getting into these different forms of writing, then I can always be looking after it, and I don't get sort of comfortable in one seat. And so there's a way in which the work is away from me as well, because like I'm also sort of trying to not chase it, but I would say like maybe like look after it or walk after it. Like it's ahead of me in some ways. And I guess I'm also responding to the market too. Like there is I feel a little this is tricky to say, right? Because there's like so much amazing writing out there, but I feel like there are Black writers, indigenous writers, writers of color who know what the game is, and know right, that like the quicker you can like dial up these like white audience tears, or even white audience rage, or right, that the more you're addressing a kind of like after the Enlightenment audience, right? The more you do that, the more you center them in your work or even in the address of your work, the more you make it clear that they are your audience, the more legible you become, and the quicker those deals come in. And I just don't like that. I think there's like a real danger to a hyper legibility. And again, that raises questions for me of how am I caring about these people that I'm writing about, because they are and were and continue to be real people. And I cannot use them in that way. And I think maybe working against a kind of legibility is something that I have to do. I need to do it. And I think there are a lot of parts in the book that are not trying to be legible at all. Like there are very local things. Like there's like an ice cream shop that nobody else knows about. My partner was like, how is somebody supposed to know about Taste the Tropics and the Guinness flavor? And I just had to say that is not my concern. My concern is for who that is legible to. And maybe they can have the rest of the book, but they don't have that moment. And they're going to have to figure out a way to be okay with that. And I think an audience or a reader that is willing to do that is a reader that I'm willing to engage with, because it's not about, quite frankly, it's not about them. Like it's about like how they're also being generous in the taking up of this book, and that there is also a work required as a reader to show up to somebody else's house.
I really like that. I think first of all, I think it's something that actually really happens in the book, but I really love it as an ethic of the composition itself to demand something of the reader that's ethical, right? to read without imperialism, which is very difficult, because I do think our reading habits are imperial. I mean, again, to just thinking of Glissant, I mean, he really resists the term comprehend, right? Comprendre, right? Because he says it has as its component part prendre, right? To seize.
Yes.
And he has some line, I should actually have the exact wording committed to memories, but he's like, for some of us in the global empire, to be seized has a special meaning. It's some sort of like, sort of wink, but of melancholy, really.
Right.
But he's like, that his argument for opacity is in some ways exactly that. It's like, it's not only for us to protect, but in order to actually draw something different out of the reader. And, but that's, for him, that's a poetics, that's an essay, but you practice it. It's really pretty amazing that way, I have to say.
Well, I think part of it too is I'm also well aware of just how I have been in this world. Like I have been imperially educated, right? I went to these schools. I got this master's degree. I'm not going to sit here and pretend that there's not a way in which imperialism is in my hand. And I think I felt that very much, being raised by my mom and being in my family, right? That the imperialism comes out in ways that you don't even realize as a person in it, right? It's like suddenly like sort of making suggestions as to how something should be, or making translations as to, what is the proper English for this? Or like, when are I make a joke that we really speak the Queen's English in my household, but my partner are two people who just went to these schools. Like we were just sort of raised in these ways that were about always kind of negotiating and assimilation. And, my sort of trajectory over the last 5, 6, 7 years was really about coming home. It's about like going off to these institutions, but then I don't know, just like not getting untethered in a really dangerous way. And the older that I got, the more my mom was concerned about that, was like how much these opportunities for success, for, career, education, like how much that was important for us as people who grew up without any money, but also the danger and how much I would come back a stranger, and maybe perhaps a fear that I would not come back at all. And I think after she died, there was like a real like I got smacked in the face with that return home. And like, it was really, you know, when you talk about that math, that was part of it. That like I have two sisters, and between the three of us, there was no amount of being competent. There were no number of degrees. They were both in graduate programs at the time. There were no amount of degrees. There were not any, you know, diplomas we could hand to the doctors to say, my mom needs to live. Like, there was a way in which even the math of having raised us so that something like this didn't happen, even that wasn't enough. And this feeling of like, oh my God, like what, when is it ever enough? And these incalculable losses, they are truly incalculable. And there is no amount of work you can do to protect from them. And there's, again, I think I'm thinking about like the kind of life I had like growing up. That's really what you hear. Like, you have these immigrant, you know, you're children of immigrants, and the idea is like, okay, but your parents came to America for a reason. And so you really gotta do the math on this. Like, you really gotta put some numbers together so that you have quadrupled on the investment that they've made. And there are several ways in which that didn't pan out for us, like in real flesh, like fleshy ways. Like, there are just bodies that are not living anymore, that are not right, that are sort of not breathing. People that are not sort of here and breathing. And I guess I wanted to figure out the math on that too. And maybe it's like a really unsatisfying that there is, for all the real numbers, for all the rational numbers, or even irrational numbers, right? For all the integers, that there's never an answer that is going to be satisfying.
So on that sort of homecoming, you know, coming home, I want to, it's sort of segues really nicely into this passage that I wanted to ask you about. And it's interesting because I typed it out because I wanted to read it. But it was also, I think there's something really interesting about someone reading it who's not you. I mean, I'm going to read it, but you know, part of the intimacy of the poem is, I think it makes, of the poetry, I think makes the reading of it, you know, out loud a really interesting process. But this is one that is, for me, really a passage. And I just want to ask you sort of, you know, what's going on here and how does it embody some of the things you're trying to do in the collection? And one of the reasons why I pulled it out, it's page 136 and 137, is because it does mix together so many different levels of poetic discourse, right? It's a poem, but it's also a discourse in that it's you know, framing and phrasing realities. So I'll read this and then just simply ask you, you know, what in terms of all of this, like, you know, Blackness, history, intimacy, incarnation, family, death, birth, violence, pleasure, what's going on. So you write, my sisters and I turn to our mothers, stay on the phone too long, laugh as much as we can, make deals where we must. I fall asleep on the couch watching basketball, tonguing the blackness between my teeth, home of the woman who birthed me. I make me my mother's. My sisters make fish, make women who do not rest in. I first meet violence, first meet empire, always urgent care. I, black, I, EYE, I, unfinished. And then the next facing page is just simply this phrase, let the girl work.
That was a great read.
Okay.
You didn't do too bad there. I was following along with you in the book. I really love that passage. It's one of the ones that got away from me. And when I say that, I mean, like, it's not about, you know, reporting on my mother's illness, and it's also not about reporting on family memories. So there's a way in which it's not fact in a way that I don't know, it's almost like a future message. Like, I feel like I wrote it, I was like, this is it. I don't actually quite totally understand what it means yet. But what I really love about it is how mired it is in the physical action of becoming. Like, it's a passage about transforming into creatures, right? Like right into somebody else, like into these creatures. Like it's about, but it's almost like a transubstantiation, right? Like it's about becoming something else. And like I think for me, like there are things that I maybe might becoming that I don't quite yet know, but I do know some of the markers of what I'm working with, which is empire, which is right, like which is like even womanhood, just like even the notion of being a woman, the notion of being a sister. Like these are sort of some material parts that like I know quite well. I don't quite know what they will lead into, but like I know maybe like the ingredients that are going into the pot. And you know, it's funny, even like the end of that sort of cascade with, especially with the, like the care and the black and the unfinished. This is a very black book for me in that I am just, I know, I sometimes say this, I'm just like a regular ass black girl from Flatbush. Like I'm just a black girl from Brooklyn. And I just can't do anything else other than be that. And there's something so total about it. And there is also something like quite, like I can't translate. Like I actually can't do the work of like telling somebody what that means. I know what it is. I can't tell you what it means. And that was really the only way for me to like get that thought in there. I know part of what it means is looking back at the women who have raised me, or looking back at the women I'm a part of and seeing the ways in which we look and we look like or resemble each other. You know, those days where I look like my mom, or I look like my mother, or I look like my sister, or I look like my cousin who is my sister. Like we are all each other, even when we are not each other, when we're trying to be ourselves. And all of that is so mumbled up in that next line, which is just to let the girl work. And it's in italics because it's coming from one of the margin characters, right? There's all this language throughout the book in the margins. And for me, it's these characters that I call imaginaries that sort of take up the work of something else that I can't quite do as Diane, that I think of them as characters like in the side play of this book. And it's at a point where the imaginaries are also talking to me. And that's sort of like what they're asking perhaps the reader to do, is to like, let me just figure that out for a second. Like I just kind of laid some things out. I don't know what it is. Maybe you were sort of expecting a volta. Maybe you were expecting the language to take a turn that made sense of it all. And the imaginary has to come in and be like, like she's kind of working on something. She doesn't even know yet. Just like give her a break.
I love that. I mean, because when I read it, I mean, you know, as a reader, you know, my own sort of journey through that, because I've read it multiple times and tried to pay attention to where it takes me. Like you said, empire, mother, woman, right? You know, big metaphysical, you know, epistemological moments that are opaque and intimate, all at the same time, but also making fish, you know, I mean, that's really visceral. You know, when people make fish, the whole apartment complex smells it. The house is full of it, right? It lingers, and it's a meal, but also like watching basketball on the couch. And, you know, I mean, it's sort of funny. I just will go ahead and mention this. I read that and I was like, I wonder if that was one of the times, like the handful of times you and I have tweeted back and forth about Kawhi Leonard.
It was.
Right? When he was playing for Toronto or for San Antonio. But it was sort of interesting because it like draws, again, like that's what I like about the mundane. That's also really visceral, but is also a part of connections. But then it just sort of pulls itself back in the house. Right. And into history and into empire. And at that moment that I had, so this is exactly what you said, that moment that I had reading down that page on the left facing side, I was like, well, how do all these things fit together? And I think it actually does that. It's like, let the girl work. It's like that impulse towards reconciliation is something that you, in that moment, you really just are like, just let it work.
Yeah.
Right? Not you do the work as reader. It's like, let the girl work. And when people work, they have privacy, right? But they're also producing something, right? Because that's what work does, is it's a private activity. When you say, let the girl work, it's like, leave her alone.
Yeah.
But it's also like, she's working to produce something. That's what you have, and let her keep working. Let me ask you about a different passage, if I can. This is going back, a dozen or so pages, 120 and 121. And, you mentioned Catholic schooling. And I do think there's the real thread across the collection around the sacred and the profane that comes out in this particular moment, which I'll read, but it has to be read. Like, just like that I and I, like letter I, first person, and EYE in the previous part that I'd read, it also is here. So you write in this 120 and 121, say, I can't finish writing the book because I ate the poems. Listen. I love that. Listen, right? Stops. Listen. I've sat in the last pew of too many churches to pretend I don't know how to. And then on the facing page, spaced out, 2 words, which are homophonies, but in writing are 2 completely different, or maybe not completely different words. Pray, P-R-A-Y, and pray, P-R-E-Y. And this is one of these moments where, you've already talked about this, where we have to read and speak at the same time.
Yeah.
Right? Because it's not just you have to read it to see the difference. It's also you have to hear it in order to not hear the difference.
Yeah.
And so I'm wondering, in terms of this and similar moments, both about, the ambivalence of the profane and the sacred that's sort of at the heart of desire, because this book has a lot of desire in it, right?
Yeah.
So profane desire, desires of all kind. I think, what I just read about fish, that sort of profane desire. Because when I read that, I was like, oh, I want fish. You you get that sense of like the smell and the taste and the particular satisfaction. But then there's also the sacred of that passage, which is that it's a prayer, right? About empire and about mothers and about becoming.
Yeah.
So I wonder, just in this passage, and just throwing out those words, the sacred and the profane, how these sort of function to make sure that nothing gets reconciled, but everything gets put in relation, perhaps.
Yeah, I was actually just going to say, for me, I have to go back to relation. And I think something I am always trying to do is relate the sacred and the profane, so that so that something gets revealed about, either one that I didn't know before. And I'm really always trying to push them against each other. As a person, I'm pretty mild mannered. I'm pretty chill. Like, I have a very cool disposition, but I think in terms of my questions, what I'm trying to like work through when I write, it's a lot. I'm really a bit obsessed with the sacred, what gets considered sacred, and I'm also obsessed with profanity. Like, I have a thing of like getting down and dirty, whether it's like sort of smells, right? Like whether it's like taste, whether it's like sort of carnal desires. Like, this is like a place where my mind is like, yeah. I love getting into that. I think it's because it's a thing that we lie about a lot. And I think the thing about the sacred and the profane is that they're both very true, right? Like, your experience of them, whatever that means for you, it's like so absolute that it simply is, that it simply is true. If something like totally revolts you, it does that totally. You're just like, this is completely disgusting. And on the other hand, if there's something that you find really sacred, really dear, it also does that, right? Like, there's a part of you that's not thinking through it. You're really, in a flesh way, feeling your relation to that thing. And I think in this desire, or maybe it's like I think it's a prayer to get closer to my body, like to just like get back in my body. Like, I'm trying to knock those two together. And so there's like always like a double take there, right? So like to pray, and to also know that you are prey, right? That you are prey to empire. You are prey to you're prey to your body. Your body might just start eating itself, right? And becomes prey in that way. You're prey to the insurance companies. You're prey. And like, all of that is happening at the same time that you are trying to pray for something, that you are trying to pray for a better life. And I feel like maybe kind of like doing this thing of like, reflecting on my mom's lives, like really seeing that play out, with them both in very different but very similar ways. And then again, thinking about, okay, what does that mean for me? When am I pray? And when am I trying to pray? And perhaps my sort of dissatisfaction, perhaps my my grief is like also tied up in that. Like maybe I'm just sad that like I just want to have the thing that I pray for, but I'm too busy being prey. And like, what is that?
Yeah. Well, in some ways, you know, just the way you put it, it's in some ways that's what what the event of dying in a bureaucratic culture is.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, you know, you've been autobiographical. I've been autobiographical myself. You know, when my father passed away, he was struck and killed by a car, and you know, they kept him on life support, and so that we could all go say goodbye, which is a kind of prayer. It's not a religious. You don't have to have a faith, but it's a way of, you know. I remember holding his hand, and you know, as he was, I mean, he was just, you know, held together by life support,
right?
So not conscious. And so there was like this prayerful moment. We all got our time, and it was everybody was very quiet, but we also said things, and, you know, it was a ritual. But then when I left the room, who did I sit down with? Somebody who wanted to know about organ donation.
Yeah.
And was pressuring me, because I became the spokesperson for the family in the moment, pressuring me, you know. I felt like pray, you know. I felt like, you're vulnerable, but here's what I want from you. And it is, you know, it's a virtuous thing that he was asking, right? But it's still was that pray and pray at the same time. And, you know, I don't know how we escape that in our bureaucratic culture, that pray and pray. And it's really terrifying, but it's also something, because it's terrifying, because it's profane and sacred, it's revolting and alluring, all at the same time, is something that calls for poetic treatment.
Yeah, it's completely wild that you just offered that story, because my mom needed a liver transplant. She had an autoimmune liver condition that it just kind of showed up one day and was like, hey, like, I'm really going to go wild on you. And she needed a liver transplant. And the thing about living in New York is that you don't get a lot of liver donations because it's not a big driving city. Basically, the liver needs to be live for the donation to work. So, you know, we had a couple of rounds of like things not quite working out. And one of the rounds where it was like, it looked like we were going to get a liver, the family needed to say goodbye. And it was this thing where it was really up against the clock, and it just took too long. And I had this moment of feeling like, I can't even take that away from them. Like, I can't be mad. Like, they're like, you know, like that there is just like a ritual, right? A prayer that they need to do. And I can't look at this person that they have just lost as prey. Like, I can't just be sort of like after the things in this person's body, because it sort of betters my situation. And it felt like it was weird to know that in that moment, and to know that I could know that because I have been prey, and that I wouldn't, right? That like, I wouldn't want to be treated in that way. And that is not the history of empire. Empire is full of greedy people who take bodies because they can and because it conveniences them, and that they do not think twice about what it means for somebody else along the line. And to have been prey, to have ancestors who have been prey, and to now have the knowledge of, no, you don't do that. You just don't do that. It's part of what's going on there too. And to sort of have to, at the end of knowing that kind of virtuous knowledge, right, also still doesn't get me a liver. It just gets me the thing of being not even a human, but being a creature. And being a creature who might get this liver they need and might not. Being a creature who might be living and might not. And the complete humility in that. And then also knowing that is what gets me to a point way later in the book where I'm able to live with someone and make a life with them, because I remember that I'm just trying to be a creature with you for a time.
Empty bowl delivers their own eulogy, and everything became quiet enough to hear my last labored breath, held time in my wet lungs, walked across the desert carrying every moment we failed,
collapsed, dragged our time deep under sand, stubborn, stalked around in silence, patient for a moment when you weren't looking, crawled into that moment's closet to die in peace, unseen.
So let me ask you, a couple of questions as a way of wrapping up. The funny thing about writing a book is that we write with all sorts of intention. We have things we want out of the book, and whether it's an explicitly and thematically intimate book like this particular collection of poetry, or even an abstract academic book, right? There's so much of yourself in the book that then when it's put in the hands of readers is brings along with it a lot of anxiety, right? What are they going to see? How are they going to read it? And also, and you've spoken to this already. Also, the desire, hopefully, for most of us, to not be imperial, right? To demand like the readers take a particular thing out of the book. But at the same time, we write books with an idea of at least how the book forms a sensibility or a set of sensibilities for the reader that they walk away from it with. Mm-hmm. And I say walk away from it because I think there's a difference between what your takeaway, which is like a sound bite or a slogan or something, but walk away. I like that. I always use that phrase because, the way we walk, you can see somebody walk and have a guess if they're sad or happy, or, our sensibilities, our affective states are so captured in our walk, right? So in that sort of idea of walking away from the book, what are some of the hopes that you have for us as readers in terms of the sensibilities that we walk away with and the way we walk away differently after reading the Math of Saint Felix?
Oh, that's really a great question. I mean, you could have just sort of asked me that in a different way, but I think that contextualizing is really helpful and generous. I want people to know, or maybe to sort of learn the ways in which they are just creatures. I think, I write about my family a lot. I think they are a treasure trove of content. I think there are things I'm trying to understand about how I got here, how we got here, what it means to be people, trying to people together. And I just happen to look at my family in order to do that. There's something, it feels a bit epic when I think about them in particular, because when I'm thinking about my family, I'm thinking about whole villages, right? So it's not just these people I'm blood related to, but I'm thinking about these particular communities in Southwest Haiti. It's, I think something that I learned while writing this book was just how much of a creature I am. It does not make me extra special that I sort of was able to turn this language around. It did not bring my mom back, right? She didn't undie with the writing of this book. I'm still a middle sister, right? There's also something completely mundane about the finishing of the book. It did not turn me into a star. I did not it did not get me a house, right? There are so many things about my life that have just gone on having finished writing the book. Mm-hmm. And yet I feel like a completely different creature for having written it. And there's something, I don't know, it's like small, again, very humble, very mundane metamorphosis that I want to offer to people as being possible, that you could experience quite truly the worst thing that you could have ever imagined. And odds are you might just get up the next day. And what are you going to do with that, right? What happens again when we sort of stop with the imperial thinking and stop thinking that, the tragedy of our lives is the entire world, that even in the moments of my mom dying, it's so crazy. When she got into the hospital, that's when the Kavanaugh hearings were going on. And there were so many things that were happening where I got angry. I just wanted the world to stop. I had this feeling of like, yo, like this lady's body is falling apart. Why does everything have to be so big, so loud, so annoying? Why can't the thing that I'm going through take precedence? Like, why can't it matter the most? And parts of that are like obvious. That's of course like a totally reasonable reaction to have to something way bigger than you can imagine happening to you and the people you love. But there is, I think where it could have the potential to go wrong is like when that happens in the sort of context of empire or capitalism or imperialism, where then people feel like they have the right to inflict the kind of violence because they feel like they are, sort of being violated, or that they are just not getting the thing that they want. And like I think there is something about the dissatisfaction of desire, whatever that desire is, whether it's wanting your mom to get a liver donation or wanting the person you're dating to just like you back.
Yeah.
Right? That like whatever these desires are, or honestly wanting a piece of fish, wanting a slice of pizza, whatever it is, to sort of respect the creatureliness of it, that is a thing that creatures do. They want things, but to then know that, and maybe sort of even revel in the fact that you might not get it. And like, that has to be okay. I don't know. That's part of maybe my biggest thing is that like, I wanted to feel humbled by writing this book. And I want people to also feel like they can be humble. Like it's okay to feel maybe small in certain places, and that there's like an intimacy of that where your life can really happen. Like what happens when you just be the creature that crawls inside with your other creatures. You know?
Yeah. Well, I love the way that this conversation has really, your side of the conversation has really brought out this idea of creature and creatureliness. I mean, it's creature and creatureliness are things that really interest me as a theorist, precisely because it combines the mundane and the sublime. I mean, creature and creatureliness is linked to creation, right? Which is linked to God. I mean, God is the name for the creator. But there's also the way that God is always like dissatisfied with the creation. A flood and everybody's gone. The fire next time, right?
Right.
All right, I'm going to make a kid and he's going to grow up and you're going to murder him on a cross. It's like, I'm going to like beleaguer you in the desert, and religions get built up out of not just the sublime beauty of Judaism, monotheism, right, of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. It's not just the beauty and sublimity of creation, but also the specter of disappointment. Right? But that creation keeps happening. And so for me, this creatureliness, I'm from this conversation, I'm going to be thinking about it a lot. I mean, it's already a term that I think about a lot in my own work, in my own teaching, my own conversation with others and myself. But this is like opening up like really beautiful dimensions of it. Because I think it's so interesting the way that I asked you about how you want readers to walk away. And you talked about how readers walk away from this at the same time as talking about yourself walking away from it.
Yeah.
But that's, I think, what that creatureliness is it's like the difference between you and the reader is sort of collapsed in this idea.
Yeah. Yeah. And, it always ends in relation. I think in sort of like thinking about how I want somebody else to walk, like I have to become them, or that I have to relate to them in some way. And so that I become reader. Yeah. Yeah. We gotta figure out this creature thing. I think that's really what I'm on these days. There's something there that the human can't, because too much has happened. I think it is this thing of that, like, we go on until we don't, and then we keep going on. I think that's what creaturely thinking makes me think of, that like, you really do, you go on until you stop. And then you keep going, whether that is the people around you, right? The people that you relate to keep going, or whether it's that somebody's looking at your photographs and puts them in a book. And now you continue to keep going, that those women are so alive in those photos in a way that doesn't track with the fact that, they have both passed away. And I think there is something about, yes, like something in there that's like, it's beyond the human. Like, it's not about turning them into humans. I get it. They were and are women. That's not really my task, but it's like finding the creature inside that makes it something else.
So, creature creation, let me take it out of these very transhistorical, affective, existential dimension, and just ask as a sort of final question, where does this also lead you as a writer? Right, you've talked a lot about how it sort of where it has led you and what things it's opened up for you in terms of a thinker and a person and someone positioned between geographies, Haiti, Flatbush, mother, daughter. But as a writer, sort of, and this is a what's next kind of question, which I always hesitate to ask because you have a right to just sit with your book, right? But
right.
I also know, you're a creative, and so what's next?
Well, it's funny. After my mom passed, maybe 6 months later, my paternal aunt, I have one aunt left, and it's on my father's side, and she handed me this book of poems that my father apparently had written in his days. And I was a little like, death is weird because it like opens these, it just creates chasms. Some of those chasms feel like a deep grief abyss that you can't climb out of, but also some of those chasms are openings for other connections. Sure. And my aunt lives in Brooklyn, but we're not incredibly close, and for reasons that are often having to do with giant families. But she handed me this thing of poems, and I just rolled my eyes. And I was like, of course, this man was a poet. Of course, nobody bothered to tell me until I was like 32.
Jesus, yeah.
And there are these poems written in French. And, something that's been on my mind is learning French again. I haven't studied French since high school. And perhaps translating them, and maybe then translating them into Creole from the French, and then trying to respond to him in English. And it makes sense to me as something to work on because of the book that I just wrote. And even before I wrote the book, I was working on this play that had it was a little bit inspired by thinking about my parents. But these are conversations I'm always trying to have. And it's not an obsession of like my people, right? Like I'm not trying to be like, oh my God, my family is so important. Like these are the only narratives that matter. But it is trying to understand the world through these intimate relations and intimate acts. And for me, that kind of opacity really opens up to something so much larger. And so I think this is how I'm thinking about myself maybe in the next couple of years, is like somebody who's like working deep within family archive to perhaps understand these geographies. I'm really thinking a lot about the relationship and the miles between Haiti and the US. And, there's like one timeline of just like, thinking about these people making it over. But there's also the other timeline of thinking about things like the AIDS epidemic and like all of these like sort of like political actions that go on. And I think that's maybe what my interest in figuring out my family's business is really thinking about it in world time. And again, thinking about it in world time outside of US imperial time. Because I think there's a other thing where like when you sort of focus so much on what's happening in the States that you cannot see the world. And I think that's part of my obsession with thinking about the links between Haiti and the US, which I didn't realize before. I think I just thought these stories were crazy and that it would be fun to kind of figure them out. But now I'm really like, oh, there is something else happening. And there are people who are trying to live their lives while world empires wreak havoc. And if I can just sort of trace these stories a bit tighter, look at them a bit closer, maybe something else can get revealed.
I love that. I can't wait to see where this work on world time rather than U.S. imperial time goes. That's such a wonderful framing. That's really rich and promising, and I can't wait to see where that goes. And I'm so grateful that you took time for this. I've always had a lot of respect for you as a thinker and observer. I love this collection of poems. And this was really amazing to hear you talk about it. I think it adds so much texture to the collection and will make me reread it with a different kind of intensity. And so thank you for that.
Oh, thank you so much, John. This was really wonderful. I don't think I've actually had the chance to slow down with the book in this way up till now, in terms of talking about it with someone who has had the time to read it through. So this was really, really wonderful. I feel like I actually learned some things that I hadn't quite realized before. So I just have to thank you again for reaching out and making the time. I can get onto tangents, so I appreciate your rolling with me.
They're all really interesting. Well, I look forward to seeing your next work, plays, poems, and so forth. And thank you again.
Yeah, I'll see you online around playoff time.
Absolutely. All right. Take care, Diane.
All right. You too.
There are things between us that are dead, crisp and unchanging, wherever we dwell. Whether we crawl or are swept, we build our home with death for a neighbor. Musician's condo on the cemetery's lot, dense violet fog the night you say you are loving me. Grief engulfs my eyes wherever I behold you. We sit in pews, we sit in waiting rooms, we look forward, we hold our breath, we carry over. We cross streets made holy by what we've turned into love. We cross streets where our loves have been taken away. We see a cockroach crawling from the corner of our left eye and pray that if we ignore it, then. Sun glistens over my mother's ledgers as much as it illuminates skin. I trace amaranthine fingers over all. I am no saint over city's hallowed dirt. I am no saint carried over city's cursed asphalt. I am no saint. Let avenues turn to dust. When sisters' eyes ring the bell for the day's low tide, the sun shines, the sky a violent it's never been.